In the last section, we set up some integration between Travis CI and GitHub. Now, anytime that we push our code up to GitHub, Travis CI is going to get a little tap on the shoulder and be told, hey, this person just pushed some new code. Download the code and do some amount of work on it. Now the real question is, what is Travis going to do with our code base? Well, Travis is not going to just automatically or magically figure out what to do. We have to be very explicit, very clear with Travis CI and say, here is exactly what we want you to do. We want you to test our code, and then if all the tests pass, we want you to deploy our project over to AWS. For right now, we're just going to focus on getting everything set up for running our tests. We're not going to worry about the AWS deployment just yet. So even with running our tests, we have to give Travis a little bit of direction. We have to tell it how to essentially start up Docker, how to run our test suite, and how to interpret the results. In order to do so, we're going to create a file called the travis.yaml file, and we're going to put that into our root project directory. The travis.yaml file is going to have this series of directions to tell Travis exactly what we want it to do. Now I put together a little diagram to kind of outline the different steps that we're going to put into that file. So here's what we need to do inside the travis.yaml file. First off, we're going to tell Travis that we need to have a copy of Docker running. Our entire project relies upon Docker. We need the Docker CLI to build an image and to create a container out of that image. And so definitely, as soon as Travis pulls down our entire repository, we need to have a copy of Docker waiting to go, or ready to go, ready for us to run a couple commands to build our image and then run our test suite. So after we tell after we tell Travis that we need a copy of Docker, we'll then write a little bit of configuration to tell Travis to build our image using the dockerfile.dev file. Now, that might be a little bit surprising, the fact that I'm saying we're going to use dockerfile.dev. Well, quick reminder here, the entire purpose of Travis is to first run our test suite. We put together the Docker file, like that production Docker file, just a moment ago. This one right here is specifically used when we want to create a container that is going to be used in production, running on some server ready for users to come and visit. The image that is created by this Docker file has no dependencies or any code inside of it meant for running our test suite. If we want to run our test suite, we have to use the dockerfile.dev file instead. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that we build an image using the dockerfile.dev file. After we build the image, we'll then tell Travis how to run our test suite. Essentially, we're going to say, hey, to run our test suite, execute docker run our image npm run test. That's pretty much it. Then at some point in time in the future, we're going to come back and make sure that we also tell Travis how to deploy our project over to AWS. But again, we're not going to do that just yet. Just to make sure that's clear, I'll put that in yellow. So for right now, we're just focused on getting our test to run on Travis. So let's get to it. I'm going to flip back over to my code editor, and in my root project directory, I'm going to make a new file called .travis.yml, like so. Now, really important here, please, please, please make sure you get that leading dot. It's .travis.yaml. If you don't have that leading dot right there, we're going to run into some issues later on. Okay, so now inside of here, we're going to start writing out some configuration for these 3 steps. Now the configuration that we're going to put in here, we're going to go over rather quickly, just because this is not quite so much a course about Travis. It's supposed to be about Docker, so I'll give you some brief explanation about each of the steps. The first thing we're going to do is say sudo required. Anytime that we're making use of Docker, we have to have super user permissions. And so sudo required says, hey Travis, we need super user level permissions in order to execute this build. The next thing we're going to do is make sure that Travis CI understands that we need the Docker CLI pre-installed. So we'll say services and then list out Docker, like so. By adding this in, Travis CI is going to automatically install a copy of Docker into our little running container. Well, I don't really want to get into what Travis does behind the scenes, but essentially this is going to say, hey, Travis CI, we need a copy of Docker ready to go. After that, we'll define another section called before install. Before install right here is going to have a series of different commands that get executed before our tests are ran. And so you can kind of imagine anything that we list right here as being some series of steps or some series of setup that needs to occur before we start to either deploy our project or before we start to run our tests. And so for you and I, we want to attempt to build our Docker image before the tests run. So I'm going to put in a little dash, and then we'll write out the command that should be executed to build our Docker image. So we'll say docker build. We're going to make sure that we force this thing to use the dockerfile.dev file. So I'll say -f dockerfile.dev, and then we'll set the build context by putting a .in, which remember essentially means use the current directory when figuring out what to do. Now one last quick thing here. Remember, anytime that we run docker build, we get back the ID of the image that is created. Throughout this course, we've been copy pasting that ID around, but you can kind of imagine that when we start doing this stuff with Travis CI, we don't really get the ability to easily copy paste those IDs around. We're not involved in this process one bit. These are all automated commands that are going to be executed on our behalf. So in order to avoid having to kind of juggle that ID around and copy paste it to the next command, we'll instead just put a tag or a label of sorts on the image that is created. So we can refer to the image that is created by a name rather than a randomly generated ID. So to tag this thing, I'll say -t, then my Docker username, which is Stephen Grider. Again, that's my Docker username. And I'll say dash, and I'll put in the name of the repository that we are building from here, docker-react. So docker-react. So now in the future, we could refer to the image that is created by saying Stephen Grider /docker/react, or whatever your username is. Now, one thing to be aware of here, we do not have to tag this thing with this really long, very formal tag. We could just as easily say my image, or test me, or something like that, because the tag that is being applied here is only going to be used inside of this essentially Travis process, not going to be used anywhere else. So you can use any tag you want there, but it is good convention to use the real convention here, which is the Docker username and then the repository name after it. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to start to tell Travis how to run our test suite, and then we'll try doing a test deploy this and make sure that everything works as expected. So I'm going to save this file, and we'll do a quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.